I've alluded to this a couple other times, where you have the temperance movement. The temperance movement is a combination of, first off, religious beliefs about kind of the, not being dependent on anything other than God. You also have concerns about the factory system. You don't want people showing up hungover. That a factory system depends on everybody being willing to do their part. And if one person doesn't do their part, then that affects the entire line. When you were a farmer, if you were hungover and didn't, plow your crops that day, that was all on you, right? And so it's a difference in kind of the way of looking at sobriety. The United States has always had a tendency to drink a lot. Alcohol consumption has always been relatively high. But you definitely see that beginning in around the 1830s, 1840s, the idea of avoiding alcohol or limiting alcohol, only having a small amount of it, becomes very popular. And again, the factory system is a part of this. Religious values are a part of this. And another kind of unfortunate part of this is going to be what we call nativism. That idea that only people born in the United States are worthy of being here, right? That immigrants shouldn't come here. Well, part of why this has this nasty little nativist kind of undercurrent with the temperance movement is due to the ethnicity of who's coming over to the country in the mid 1800s, which is primarily Irish and then primarily German. And both of those groups are going to tend to value alcohol consumption. German beer gardens, Irish whiskey, all that kind of stuff. And again, that's a broad stereotype, but I think that it exists for a reason in the sense that culturally, if you go back to Germany of the 19th century or Ireland of the 19th century, you can see where alcohol consumption was viewed much more liberally than it was in the United States. And of course, again, this is part of that religious and factory system and all that kind of stuff. Part of it, too, has to do with social class. The middle class is very concerned about what they see with the working class, that they see men who abuse their wives, that they see men that, keep getting their wife pregnant. And the problems that come from kind of this uncontrolled childbirth, right, for these working class people. And so the real concern is, you're creating this social problem, right? Remember, the middle class is very concerned about this. And so they're going to be looking at the working class, and they're looking at instances of poverty. They're looking at instances of abuse. They're looking at instances of, cycles of poverty, dangerous, people who are a threat as far as the factory system and how that works. And so they really kind of see social problems as being a product of excess drinking, which has an element, that is part of it. Now, the problem is correlation is not causation, right? So yes, you do have, there is a comparison between the working class and the factory system and an increase in inebriation and, drinking and stuff among those factory workers. Now, what is probably more the direct causation is they're pretty frustrated. They're not being paid enough. They're struggling. The work is mind-numbing and not very exciting, and they're kind of trapped. And so they drink to escape, right? Which is probably your causation. Same kind of causation that you see with why people abuse substances today. Why do we have, an epidemic of despair happening among the working classes in 2017, leading to the opioid crisis and alcohol disease and all that kind of stuff? Well, it's for the same reason, right? So part of what's going to happen is the middle class is going to start to say, well, maybe we need to restrict alcohol or encourage people not to drink alcohol. So they create the American Temperance Society. American Temperance Society basically has men and women take pledges of abstinence. I will not drink, right? Ever, ever, ever. You have, the American Temperance Society. Some people would not necessarily voluntarily abstain from alcohol, but they would certainly limit. So they would only have like one particular kind of alcohol and only like one little glass a day or something like that. So very much kind of this tightly controlled use of alcohol consumption. And again, it appeals on a lot of different levels. This idea that sobriety encourages you to be, awake and engaged in the world around you. You're less easily swayed politically because if you're not a big drinker, you're not going to go to the saloon while, that whole Jackson Van Buren a political system where, hey, we have a big party and you're going to vote for my candidate, right? If you're not drinking, that's not going to be attractive to you. It also is going to reinforce the factory, and it's going to defend the home because, again, it's going to encourage the man to be sober enough to work. It's going to encourage him not to, force himself on his wife and then have an unplanned pregnancy. It's going to, he's not going to have a tendency to beat his wife out of frustration, that kind of thing. But it definitely is about forcing middle-class values onto the working class, telling the working class, by this incorrect correlation causation, by saying, oh, well, the problems of the working class are due to their excess alcohol consumption, as opposed to the problems of the working class are due to a factory system that exploits them, and they drink to escape their exploitation, as opposed to addressing that factor. So it's kind of turned around a little bit in a way that the middle class, who has more economic security, can say our values matter more than your values. And I think this is a trend that you see even today, in the way people live and, what kind of cars they drive or, how they dress, all that kind of stuff. And, of course, like I said, is it anti-immigrant? And what will happen is the temperance movement will be kind of this simmering political issue. In other words, it begins around the 1830s, 1840s. We'll see it culminating in 1920 with the 18th Amendment, right? But it doesn't happen overnight. Temperance and that attitude towards alcohol consumption is going to be one of those kind of hot button issues. The litmus test issues is what I was looking for a politician that says, hey, I'm for or I'm against temperance. This is going to be something that for some people, this is going to be a voting issue. For other people, it's just more part of who a candidate is. But understand that the temperance movement will gain momentum over the decades in the 19th century in order to gain prominence, leading ultimately to the prohibition of alcohol consumption, which then Americans promptly begin to ignore. So the next thing I want to talk about is education. This is another reform, again, trying to make sense out of this community. We have social problems we want to address. Temperance people want to limit alcohol consumption, encourage the working class to live a cleaner, healthier life. Horace Mann in the educational system is going to say what we really need is to educate people. Sure, you can tell them not to drink alcohol, but if they just were educated and they had hope for the future and they could read and they could distract themselves, then they wouldn't have any need to go drink, right? So Horace Mann is going to begin this idea of universal education, which is an education system you guys are familiar with, right? This is why we have public schools. So Horace Mann is extremely significant as far as education is concerned. So future teachers, you'll be hearing about Horace Mann plenty. But again, it's this idea of universal education, that we teach people American values, we indoctrinate people to American ideas. So we take those immigrants and we challenge their ethnic connections with Ireland or Germany or wherever by teaching them about America, about the Declaration, about the American Revolution, about what we stand for, about George Washington, and when we teach people to read and do math, and this is going to make them better factory workers because now they can read their own instructions and they can do this, and again they can distract themselves from their frustration by reading a newspaper or reading a magazine and that kind of thing. So very driven and kind of making society better, much like the temperance movement was. Now, the religious movements are trying to make society better by fixing people on the inside so that when they express themselves with the community at large, they're trying to make a difference in the community at large. Temperance tries to has this correlation causation for the problems. Education is another way to fix this problem. And of course, education continues to be a way that we look at fixing social problems and social issues. We just need to educate people. We need to educate them and inform them. Now, the big problem in the 19th century is how do we fund this? In the southern states, they care nothing about funding public education. The Poor farmers are too busy trying to survive. Slaves, of course, should not be educated or should be minimally so. The wealthy individuals can afford to send their kids off if they want. So education is not a primary concern in the South. It's more of a concern in the Northeast and in the Midwest, where you have factories that need people that can read. But you still have questions of, how do we fund this? Do we tax everybody and pay for everyone's education? Do we make this on a donation basis? How do we do this? So the big question surrounding education in the 19th century is, how much do we expand it and who pays for it? So again, elementary education is perceived by most to be a good thing. And over time, like with the temperance movement, this will gain kind of momentum, leading ultimately to, by the time you get to the early 1900s, you pretty much have everyone getting like up to a 6th, 7th, 8th grade education. But it's going to take a few decades for this to kind of gain momentum. So understand that this is very important. You also have education as being valid for women. One of the first critiques of education was, well, we don't need to educate the women, we just need to educate the men. Except then they very quickly run into a problem of they don't have enough teachers. So they start bringing in women as teachers. Well, if you're going to bring women in as teachers, it's very hard to say, well, we're not going to educate young girls. So women begin to gain access to a very specific professional career through education as being teachers. And they begin to expand elementary education to young girls. And so again, this is going to be an element of women gaining equality that begins at this most basic level, right? And at first it was controversial. And of course, women that worked as teachers, were often restricted. They had to be unmarried and they had a very strict code of conduct they had to follow. But again, all of this feeds and supports the factory system, the idea of Republican values. Remember, we have a lot of anxiety about, is the factory system going to destroy our sense of republicanism? And the answer for education is no, it's not. It's going to help republicanism because it's going to teach people these core values. The next movement that we'll see, that I'll talk about briefly and then I'll stop, is going to be the asylum movement. You can thank Dorothea Dix for this. Dorothea Dix, and I could talk ad nauseum about this. I've seen a couple of different things, the Eastern State Penitentiary, and then I saw a reenactment with Dorothea Dix this summer. And what's really fascinating is how we see that people, and if y'all remind me, I'll show you these pictures, right? So they used to have a system by which, if you were not mentally stable, then they would separate you. They would kind of put you off. In the 18th century, it was literally like a jail cell. In the early 19th century, it was a little bit better. By the 19th century, you have a very structured system, right? The asylum movement is orphanages, taking kids who don't have parents or who have been abandoned by their parents. How do we treat them? Do we use them just as like labor? Do we try to encourage them and raise them up? Do we educate them? What do we do? Prisoners, people who have committed crimes, do we try to reform them? Do we lock them up? What do we do with them? People who are insane or not physically well, like what do we do with those people? Initially, it was separate them from society, right? Pull them out, lock them up, keep them away from us. And so the idea was that they would be out of sight, out of mind. And of course, Dorothea Dix will come in and she'll be, Jeremy Bentham, and kind of the idea that we can reform society, we can make society better, we can, through regimented kind of systems, through structure, through treating people humanely, but also treating them in this incredibly regimented way. We can begin to improve the quality of their life, improve the quality of their care, and kind of maybe eventually reintegrate them back into our society, right? That, in other words, everybody has a role to play in this Republican world. And of course, if we can somehow ease the mind, make people calm down a little bit, then we can reach to them and kind of get them to see and make sense out of the world. Well, this was certainly true in some cases, and you definitely see with the prison reform system that de Tocqueville actually comes to kind of begin to view. You're going to see that the emphasis on keeping an eye on these sort of things, on trying to reform people and trying to make their lives better, works less clearly with the mentally ill. There's a great deal of racism that comes into play here. You'll still have women that are being basically locked up because they don't follow the rules of society. So lots of kind of nuances there. So I'll kind of pick up here in the next one. The bell's about to ring. So I'm going to pause this. This is most of the asylum movement. I'll hit on a few little stories here momentarily to kind of explain this a little bit more to you. But hopefully this kind of gives